He smiled as they thanked him for the bread, whilst scheming about how exactly he would enslave them. Welcome back to Brutal History for Sleep, where your nightmares are always historically sourced. If this quietly cursed little channel helps you rest and brings even a little calm to your busy life, then our efforts are worth every second it takes to make these daily videos. So please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Tell us where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you over there. Your support goes a long way, and our appreciation for that is more than you could know. Tonight you witness Columbus promise paradise, then chain up the welcoming party and spend the next decade inventing new ways to extract gold from people, the people who welcomed him with open arms. He didn't discover a new world, he systematically dismantled the one that was already there. Close your eyes. The only sound is my voice, low and steady beside you. The sheets are warm. The room is still. Somewhere beneath the silence, you can feel it. That slow, familiar sinking, like being remembered by something you'd hoped had forgotten you. Breathe in. A torchlight flickers against carved wooden beams. The air smells like damp rope, old iron, and incense stolen from a village that doesn't exist anymore. You're dressed in silk, your boots are polished, and your journal is open to a purposeful lie. You write Asia at the top of the page, then chain another dozen men for not finding it fast enough. Tonight, Columbus isn't lost. He's in charge, and he's going to make sure that it's a most profitable journey, no matter the cost. In the damp corners of 1480s Lisbon, where sailors traded tall tales and taller drinks, there lived a wool merchant's son with a gift for mathematics. Unfortunately, his gift was being spectacularly wrong. Christopher Columbus, or Cristoforo Colombo as his mother still called him when disappointed, had convinced himself that Asia was just a quick sail west. Not because of careful calculation or scholarly consensus, but because he'd cherry-picked the smallest possible estimates of Earth's size and the largest possible guesses for Asia's width. It was confirmation bias dressed up as cartography. He'd been peddling this theory around Europe like a travelling salesman with a particularly unconvincing product. Portugal said no, twice. The Portuguese court mathematicians had done something Columbus found deeply offensive: actual math. They calculated that his proposed journey would require sailing approximately 10,000 miles of open ocean, which was both impossible and insane. Columbus responded by adjusting his figures. Not based on evidence, mind you, but based on what sounded more appealing to potential investors. By 1486, he'd taken his show to Spain, where Ferdinand and Isabella were busy with other matters, specifically ejecting Muslims and Jews from their newly unified kingdom. Columbus waited, and waited, and revised his pitch with the dedication of someone who'd confused stubbornness with vision. He added religious fervour to his economic promises. Gold to fund a new crusade, silk to dress Spanish nobility, spices to make their food less depressing, and souls, so many heathen souls just waiting to be saved. The Spanish court said maybe, then no, then maybe again. Columbus, meanwhile, had begun referring to himself in the third person and signing his name with mystical symbols. He claimed God spoke to him through biblical verses. He saw divine providence in cloud formations. His confidence was less reassuring than concerning, but it was persistent. Finally, in January 1492, Granada fell. The last Muslim stronghold in Spain surrendered, and Ferdinand and Isabella found themselves with a victory high and a depleted treasury. Columbus appeared like a blessed omen, or perhaps a cursed one, promising wealth beyond measure for the low, low price of 3 ships and a crew of men nobody would miss. The math still didn't work, but the timing did. They gave him the Santa Maria, a sluggish cargo vessel that handled like a waterlogged shoe. They gave him the Pinta and the Nina, smaller and faster, but crewed by men who'd joined primarily to avoid prison. They gave him the title Admiral of the Ocean Sea, which sounded impressive until you realized the Ocean Sea didn't technically exist yet. And they gave him governorship of any lands he might discover, which seemed safe, since everyone expected him to die at sea. On August 3, 1492, Columbus set sail from Palos de la Frontera with 90 men, bad math, and absolute certainty he was chosen by God. His calculations suggested Japan was 2,400 miles west. It was actually 12,000. But Columbus had never let reality interfere with his convictions before, and he wasn't about to start now. The voyage itself was a masterclass in manipulation. When the crew grew nervous about sailing into nothingness, Columbus kept 2 logs, one with the real distances travelled, one with shorter distances to show the men. When they panicked about the compass pointing slightly off true north, he told them it was a sign from heaven. When they threatened mutiny, he promised they were mere days from glory. He was lying, but he was good at it. On October 11, the crew had reached their limit. They demanded to turn back. Columbus asked for 3 more days. Just 3. Then, he'd admit defeat. It was either divine providence or dumb luck that land appeared the next morning. Probably the latter, but Columbus would spend the rest of his life insisting on the former. They landed on an island the locals called Guanahani. Columbus immediately renamed it San Salvador because nothing says "I respect your culture" like erasing its name. The Taino people who lived there came to greet these strange pale men in their floating houses. They brought food, water, and gifts. They showed curiosity and kindness. Columbus looked at them and saw inventory. His journal entry for that first day is a masterwork of casual dehumanization. He noted their generosity, their intelligence, their physical beauty. Then he wrote, "They ought to make good and skilled servants, for they repeat very quickly whatever we say to them." Within hours of first contact, he was already measuring them for chains. The Taino wore small gold ornaments. Columbus's eyes lit up like a slot machine hitting jackpot. He demanded to know where the gold came from. The Taino, eager to please these odd visitors, pointed vaguely south. Columbus heard what he wanted to hear: infinite gold mines just waiting for Spanish pickaxes. It was the first of many catastrophic misunderstandings. Or perhaps Columbus understood perfectly well and simply didn't care. He kidnapped several Taino to serve as guides. He called them guests. He sailed from island to island, renaming everything, claiming everything, and growing increasingly frustrated by the distinct lack of silk-wearing Chinese merchants. These islands were beautiful, but wrong. The people were friendly, but insufficiently Asian. The gold was present, but sparse. Nothing matched his promises to Ferdinand and Isabella. So Columbus did what any reasonable person would do. He started lying more creatively. Cuba became the mainland of China. Every yellow rock became evidence of nearby gold mines. Every helpful native became proof of their natural servitude. Every setback became a test from God. The delusion was so complete it had its own internal logic. On Christmas Eve, the Santa Maria ran aground on Hispaniola. The local chief, Guacanagarix, rushed to help. His people spent hours diving to salvage Spanish supplies. They housed the shipwrecked sailors. They shared their food. Columbus repaid this kindness by building a fort from his ship's wreckage and leaving 39 men behind to search for gold. He named it La Navidad. Within a year, every Spaniard there would be dead, and Columbus would blame the natives for not being better hosts to their invaders. But that was still to come. For now, Columbus collected his human souvenirs, 6 or 7 Taino he'd decided were coming to Spain, and headed home in his 2 remaining ships. He'd found precisely 0 silk roads, 0 spice markets, and 0 Chinese emperors. But he had found islands full of people who could be enslaved and land that could be claimed. For Columbus, that was close enough. The return voyage was miserable. Storms battered the ships. The kidnapped Taino grew sick. Columbus spent his time writing grandiose letters about his divine mission and the wealth that surely awaited. He practiced his triumphant return speech. He planned his next voyage. He was already dreaming of the governorship, the gold, the glory. He had no idea he'd just initiated one of history's greatest catastrophes. Or maybe he did and simply filed it under acceptable losses. After all, God had chosen him. The math had worked out. And if a few or a few million heathens had to die for Spain's glory, well, that was just good Christian economics. Columbus landed in Spain in March 1493, dressed in his finest clothes and surrounded by parrots, gold trinkets, and confused Taino people he insisted were Indians. Ferdinand and Isabella were impressed enough to fund a second voyage. 17 ships this time. 1,200 men. And Columbus, promoted to Viceroy and Governor of the Indies, which still weren't the Indies, but nobody had figured that out yet. The wool merchant's son had made good. The math had been wrong, but the results were real. And somewhere in the Caribbean, the Taino people were still talking about the strange visitors who'd renamed their islands and kidnapped their neighbors. They had no idea the visitors would be back, with more ships, and more chains, and an appetite for gold that no amount of suffering could satisfy. Columbus returned to Hispaniola in November 1493 with the confidence of a man who'd been proven right by accident. His fleet of 17 ships carried 1,200 men, soldiers, farmers, craftsmen, and priests. No women, because this was a civilizing mission, not a colonizing one. The distinction would prove academic once the raping started. He expected to find La Navidad thriving, his 39 men fat with gold and attended by grateful natives. Instead, he found ashes and bones. The fort had been burned. The Spaniards were dead. Local Taino, through gestures and broken Spanish, tried to explain. The men Columbus left had started demanding gold, food, and women. They'd raided villages. They'd taken slaves. The Taino had eventually had enough. Columbus listened to this explanation and concluded the obvious. The natives were treacherous and needed fiercer governance. He established a new settlement, La Isabela, named for the Queen, who'd funded this exercise in willful misunderstanding. The location was chosen for its strategic position, which is to say it was a malarial swamp with no fresh water. But it looked impressive on a map. And that's what mattered to a man who'd navigated across an ocean using confidence instead of accuracy. The settlement's first decree was elegant in its simplicity. All natives over the age of 14 would deliver a hawk's bell full of gold dust every 3 months. Those in regions without gold could substitute with 25 pounds of spun cotton. Those who complied would receive a copper token to wear around their necks. Those without tokens would have their hands cut off. It was supply and demand, if you defined demand as threat of mutilation. The Taino had a problem. The gold Columbus imagined simply didn't exist. Hispaniola had some gold, yes, but in small quantities that required careful panning. The hawk's bell quota was impossible. They tried to explain this. Columbus interpreted their protests as laziness. After all, he'd seen their gold ornaments. Surely they were hiding vast mines out of spite. The first public hand removal happened 3 months later. Columbus made it a ceremony. The entire village was required to watch as Spanish soldiers held down a man who'd failed to meet his quota. The cut was made with a sword, clean, efficient, professional. The man was then released to bleed out as a lesson to others. Some Spanish priests objected. Columbus reminded them that these were heathens who'd rejected God's natural order. The priests found theological comfort in this explanation. But hands were just the beginning. Columbus was an innovator in the field of colonial terror. The natives who fled to the mountains were hunted with dogs, massive mastiffs trained to disembowel on command. The Spanish called these hunts Monteria Infernal, the infernal chase. They'd release the dogs at dawn and follow the screams. Winners got to keep whatever gold ornaments they found on the corpses. Those who stayed in the villages faced different innovations. Columbus introduced the encomienda system, which granted Spanish colonists the right to native labor. Technically, the natives weren't slaves. They were entrusted to Spanish care for Christian education. The fact that this education consisted primarily of mining gold until they died was, apparently, pedagogically sound. The Spanish also discovered that the Taino made excellent practice targets. Soldiers would test their sword sharpness by seeing if they could decapitate a native with one swing. They'd place bets on who could split a man in half with a single blow. They'd grab infants by the legs and dash their heads against rocks, timing to see who could clear a hut fastest. Columbus didn't participate in these games, but he didn't stop them either. Morale was important. Meanwhile, he was sending glowing reports back to Spain. The gold was flowing. It wasn't. The natives were accepting Christianity. At sword point, the colony was thriving, if you didn't count the mass graves. He requested more supplies, more men, more ships. He promised returns that would fund a new crusade to reclaim Jerusalem. Ferdinand and Isabella, reading these reports in their comfortable palace, had no reason to doubt their admiral. The Taino tried to resist. Chief Caionabo led a confederation of tribes against the Spanish. He was captured through treachery. Columbus's captain, Alonso de Ojeda, convinced him to wear a set of shiny manacles as bracelets, then arrested him once they were locked. Caionabo was shipped to Spain but died en route. Columbus counted this as a diplomatic victory. Other chiefs tried different strategies. Some attempted appeasement, delivering whatever gold they could find and hoping it would be enough. It never was. Some tried to flee to other islands. Columbus sent ships after them. Some tried to hide in the island's interior. Columbus sent dogs. A few tried to poison the Spanish water supply with cassava juice. When caught, they were burned alive in the village square as entertainment. The Spanish needed labor, and dead natives couldn't mine gold. So Columbus instituted a more sustainable system of terror. Instead of killing workers who failed to meet quotas, they'd be flogged. 50 lashes for a first offense. 100 for a second. For a third, they'd cut off an ear or nose. Painful and disfiguring, but not fatal. The math was simple. A one-handed slave could still carry ore, but a dead slave was worthless. Women faced their own particular horrors. Columbus had forbidden his men from marrying native women without permission, so they simply took them without the formality. Girls as young as 9 were distributed among the colonists. Columbus himself gifted young women to his favorites, writing to a friend that there are plenty of dealers who go about looking for girls. Those from 9 to 10 are now in demand. He wrote this casually, between observations about weather and requests for more wine. The Taino began killing themselves rather than live under Spanish rule. Cassava poison became the preferred method, readily available and relatively peaceful. Entire villages would gather for mass suicides, parents feeding poison to their children before taking it themselves. The Spanish were baffled. These natives were being offered civilization and salvation. Why would they choose death? Columbus blamed their inherent weakness and requested more slaves from Africa to replace them. Disease helped where swords couldn't reach. Smallpox arrived with the Spanish and spread like divine judgment. The Taino had no immunity. Entire villages would be found dead, bodies covered in pustules, no Spanish sword necessary. Columbus saw this as God clearing the land for its rightful owners. The priests held masses of thanksgiving. By 1495, the Taino population of Hispaniola had dropped from an estimated 300,000 to less than 200,000. Columbus, ever the optimist, saw opportunity in crisis. Fewer natives meant less resistance. Empty villages meant free land. Dead chiefs meant easier governance. He began planning sugar plantations, calculating how much profit each acre might yield once properly cultivated with slave labor. He also started a side business in human trafficking. In 1495, he shipped 500 Taino to Spain to be sold as slaves. 200 died during the voyage. Of the 300 who survived, most died within months of reaching Spain. Isabella was reportedly disturbed by this venture, not morally, but economically. Dead slaves generated no revenue. She ordered Columbus to focus on gold instead. Columbus took this guidance to heart. He refined his quotas. He systematized his punishments. He appointed overseers to manage the terror more efficiently. The colony became a well-oiled machine of extraction, processing native bodies into Spanish gold with mechanical precision. Priests blessed the proceedings. Soldiers enforced the schedule. Accountants tracked the yields. Back in Spain, Columbus was becoming a hero. His discoveries had proven Spain's divine favor. His gold, what little actually arrived, funded royal ambitions. His stories of docile natives eager for conversion pleased the church. Nobody asked about the mechanics of this success. Nobody wanted to know. On Hispaniola, the Taino were learning that their visitors hadn't come to trade or explore. They'd come to feed, and their appetite was infinite. Every fulfilled quota led to a higher one. Every submission led to greater demands. Every kindness was interpreted as weakness. Every weakness was exploited. The lucky ones died quickly. By 1496, the Hawke's Bell system Columbus had established was producing diminishing returns. 3 years of systematic extraction had yielded a truth too terrible for him to accept. Hispaniola's gold existed in quantities that mocked his promises to Spain. The quarterly quotas that had seemed reasonable when imposed on a population of 300,000 were becoming impossible as that population plummeted toward 200,000. The mathematics of genocide were catching up with the economics of empire. Columbus's response was characteristically innovative. If the current system wasn't producing enough gold, clearly it needed refinement. He introduced registration numbers for every native over 14, transforming humans into inventory items tracked in Spanish ledgers. Each entry included name, village, quota status, and punishment record. The bureaucracy of suffering required 3 full-time clerks just to maintain the files. The ledgers revealed patterns that Columbus found useful. Certain villages consistently failed quotas while others barely met them. His solution was redistributive cruelty. Successful villages would have their quotas raised to cover the failures of others. When village leaders protested that they were being punished for their efficiency, Columbus explained that suffering was a communal responsibility. The theological justification was elegant. Just as Christ suffered for all mankind, the Taino would suffer for each other. But the Spanish overseers had grown bored with simple hand removal. 3 years of amputation had lost its theatrical impact. Columbus, ever attentive to morale, authorized creativity in enforcement. Natives who failed quotas might lose a hand, or an ear, or their nose, depending on the overseer's mood and the audience's appetite. The Spanish developed a scoring system. 1 point for a clean cut, bonus points for artistic flair, deductions for excessive bleeding that ended the entertainment too quickly. The mines themselves evolved into carefully managed death factories. Columbus's engineers calculated the optimal tunnel dimensions to maximize extraction while minimizing cave-in frequency. They discovered that natives could work in spaces too small for Spanish bodies, turning claustrophobia into competitive advantage. They instituted shift rotations based on mathematical models: 16 hours of labor, 4 hours of rest, 4 hours of food gathering for Spanish tables. The schedule was maintained until workers died, at which point fresh natives were rotated in like replacement parts. The food weapon was refined to exquisite precision. Columbus's accountants discovered that a native on quarter rations could maintain minimal productivity for exactly 43 days before total collapse. This became the new standard cycle: 40 days of starvation labor, 3 days of recovery feeding, then back to the mines. The recovery food was calculated to restore just enough strength to survive another cycle. It was efficiency that would have impressed future factory owners. Pregnancy had become both problem and opportunity. The dying population meant fewer future workers, but pregnant women were less productive in the mines. Columbus's solution was elegantly horrible. Pregnant women would work in gold washing operations where they could remain seated. The constant cold water caused miscarriages, solving the productivity problem while maintaining the fiction of humanitarian consideration. When women began avoiding pregnancy, Columbus instituted mandatory monthly fertility inspections, conducted by Spanish soldiers who developed their own interests in the process. The Taino's response was apocalyptic in its simplicity. If the Spanish wanted gold and slaves, they would ensure neither remained. Mass suicides increased, but with methodical coordination. Entire villages would gather for final ceremonies, parents feeding cassava poison to children in order of age, youngest first, to spare them the sight of their siblings dying. The adults would then take their own poison while singing traditional funeral songs adapted to include everyone present. Columbus was genuinely puzzled by this behavior. He'd offered them civilization, Christianity, and the opportunity to serve Spain's glory. Their response was to die in organized groups. He tried prohibiting cassava cultivation near villages, but the Taino simply walked further to find it. He tried making suicide a crime punishable by torture of relatives, but discovered that entire extended families were dying together, leaving no one to torture. The Spanish priests offered theological explanations. The natives were so corrupted by Satan that they preferred hell to salvation. This interpretation was comforting, because it absolved the Spanish of responsibility. If the Taino were choosing damnation, Spanish cruelty was actually merciful by comparison. Masses were held for the theoretical souls being lost, while the actual bodies were left to rot as warnings that somehow never warned anyone away from the same choice. Labour shortages led to innovative solutions. Columbus instituted a lease system where Spanish colonists could rent natives for specific projects. The rental rates were based on age, health, and specialized skills. Children were discounted, elderly were nearly free, and pregnant women came with rebate guarantees if they miscarried within the rental period. The contracts were drawn up by Spanish lawyers who'd found lucrative work adapting property law to human livestock. The breeding program became industrial in scope. Columbus appointed a reproduction overseer who maintained detailed records of fertility rates, pregnancy outcomes, and infant mortality. Women who produced healthy children received extra rations and exemption from mine work for 1 month. Those who failed to conceive within 6 months faced public humiliation and reassignment to the highest mortality work sites. Men who refused participation were castrated in front of their families, their removed parts displayed as warnings about the wages of non-cooperation. Spanish colonists had begun establishing side businesses. Some ran native fighting rings, where exhausted workers were forced to battle for Spanish entertainment and wagering. Others operated rental services for natives with specific skills, cooking, crafts, or abilities the Spanish found amusing. A few entrepreneurial soldiers started a teeth collection service, extracting gold-filled teeth from corpses, and sometimes from the living, when quotas were particularly hard to meet. Columbus encouraged this entrepreneurship. Initiative showed Spanish character. Competition improved efficiency. He issued licenses for various enterprises, taking his percentage as governor, while maintaining plausible distance from the details. When a colonist's business resulted in excessive native deaths, Columbus would issue a stern warning about resource conservation. The warning was usually accompanied by advice on more sustainable cruelty. By mid-1497, Hispaniola had become a landscape of managed extinction. Every native action was regulated. Every Spanish innovation was systematized. Every death was recorded in ledgers that tracked the colony's slide toward depopulation. Columbus's reports to Spain maintained their optimistic tone, describing temporary setbacks and promising imminent breakthroughs. He'd become so skilled at creative accounting that even he might have believed his own mathematics. The expansion into other resources was born of desperation, disguised as diversification. Brazilwood harvesting required different skills than mining, but the same expendable bodies. Cotton plantations needed workers who could survive longer than miners, leading to a classification system that sorted natives by projected longevity. Each new industry required its own quota system, punishment scale, and mortality projections. The colony was becoming a diversified portfolio of human suffering. Some Spanish colonists had begun showing signs of what later centuries would call psychological breakdown. They'd arrived expecting easy wealth and found themselves managing elaborate systems of death. Some drank themselves into stupors. Others developed elaborate justifications involving divine will and natural hierarchy. A few went mad in ways that even Columbus found excessive, requiring restraint not for moral reasons but because their enthusiasm was damaging valuable property. The Taino were running out of ways to die. Traditional suicide methods were being discovered and prevented. Escape routes were blocked. Even the mercy of disease was being managed by Spanish overseers who'd learned to isolate the sick to prevent workforce disruption. The only freedom left was the freedom to endure, and even that was regulated by Spanish schedules. Columbus stood at the center of this machinery, adjusting levers and calculating outputs. Every failed quota led to a new innovation. Every native adaptation led to a Spanish counter-adaptation. It was evolution through atrocity, each species learning from the other in a dance that could only end with one partner's extinction. By late 1497, he'd created something unprecedented, a colony that functioned as a single organism dedicated to extraction. Every component served the whole. Every failure was met with refinement. Every success was met with expansion. It was magnificent in its monstrosity, a testament to what human ingenuity could achieve when freed from the constraints of conscience. But even Columbus was beginning to sense that his creation was unsustainable. The mathematics were inexorable. Native deaths were outpacing births by ratios that no amount of forced breeding could overcome. The gold yields were declining not because natives were hiding wealth, but because they were running out of bodies to throw at the search. The colony was eating itself. His solution would require a new level of control, not just over bodies, but over minds. Not just over actions, but over the very concept of hope. He would need to become more than a governor or even a viceroy. He would need to become the god of this dying world, reshaping reality itself to match his vision. The transformation was already beginning. By 1498, Columbus returned from his third voyage with the official title of Viceroy and Governor of the Indies, powers that transformed him from administrator to absolute sovereign. The crown had granted him near popular authority over life and death in the colonies. He would use every bit of it and then invent new authorities the crown hadn't thought to prohibit. The first sign of the new order came when Columbus appointed his brothers to key positions. Bartholomew became adelantado, essentially military commander, with a reputation for creative interrogation that made seasoned soldiers nervous. Diego was appointed governor when Christopher was absent, a man who approached human suffering with an accountant's precision. Together, the Columbus brothers created a family business of brutality that would consume not just natives, but the Spanish themselves. The shift began subtly. A Spanish colonist named Adrián de Mujica questioned the distribution of native slaves. Columbus had him arrested for sedition. When other colonists protested, Columbus had Mujica hanged from the highest gallows in Santo Domingo, leaving the body to rot for weeks as a reminder that Spanish blood offered no immunity from his justice. The message was received. The viceroy's authority was absolute. Columbus instituted a new legal code that applied to all inhabitants, Spanish and native alike. Theft of crown property, which Columbus defined broadly to include everything from gold to gathering firewood without permission, was punishable by mutilation. Blasphemy, which included questioning Columbus's divine mission, meant the tongue would be cut out. Sedition, which included writing letters to Spain without approval, meant death. The Spanish colonists discovered they'd traded the predictable corruptions of European society for the arbitrary terror of a tropical autocracy. The paranoia started at the top and trickled down like poison. Columbus trusted no one except his brothers, and even that trust was conditional. He created a network of informants among both Spanish and natives, offering rewards for reports of disloyalty. Colonists began denouncing each other to curry favor or settle scores. A Spanish woman accused her neighbor of hoarding food. The neighbor lost an ear. A soldier reported his sergeant for criticizing work quotas. The sergeant was flogged until his back looked like raw meat. Francisco Roldan, once Columbus's trusted lieutenant, led a rebellion of Spanish colonists who'd grown tired of the tyranny. Columbus's response was methodical. He offered pardons to rebels who surrendered, then had them arrested on new charges once they'd disarmed. Some were hanged immediately. Others were sentenced to hard labor alongside the natives they'd once overseen. The Spanish discovered that in Columbus's hierarchy, disloyalty was the only unforgivable sin. The Columbus brothers competed in their excesses. Bartholomew became known for his dawn raids, dragging Spanish colonists from their beds for surprise loyalty tests. Those who failed to praise Columbus enthusiastically enough were subjected to punishments previously reserved for natives. Diego specialized in bureaucratic sadism, creating impossible regulations, then punishing inevitable violations. A colonist who failed to maintain his assigned quota of native workers would be assigned to work alongside them. Even the priests weren't safe. When Father Buil suggested that perhaps the natives were dying too quickly to properly convert, Columbus accused him of heresy. The priest was forced to perform mass while standing in stocks, blessing the bread and wine with manacled hands. Other clergy learned to phrase their concerns more carefully, or better yet, to have no concerns at all. The native population, already devastated, now faced a system where their Spanish tormentors were themselves tormented. Traumatized colonists took out their fear and frustration on the only people below them in the hierarchy. Punishments became more creative, more personal, more unhinged. A Spanish overseer, who'd been flogged for low production, had his native workers flogged twice as hard. The violence became recursive, each level of hierarchy inflicting their suffering downward. Columbus personally presided over the most elaborate punishments, making no distinction between Spanish and native when it came to theatrical justice. A Spanish colonist who'd stolen gold was forced to wear a red-hot crown while natives were made to parade him through the settlement. A native chief who'd hidden food and a Spanish soldier who'd helped him were hanged side by side, their crimes considered equal in Columbus's court. The economy of the colony warped under this pressure. Spanish colonists who'd come for quick wealth found themselves trapped in a system where survival meant becoming instruments of terror. Some begged to return to Spain but were denied. Desertion was punishable by death. Others tried to escape on supply ships but were caught and made examples of. The colony became a prison where the guards were as trapped as the inmates. Letters to Spain, when they managed to escape Columbus's censors, painted a picture of hell with palm trees. Colonists wrote of a viceroy who'd gone mad with power, who saw treachery everywhere, who punished Spanish Christians as harshly as heathen natives. They described brothers who competed to please Christopher with new innovations in cruelty. They begged for intervention, for rescue, for anything to end the nightmare. The Columbus brothers developed their own court culture of terror. Dinner parties where the entertainment was watching executions. Poetry competitions where the subject was proper governance through fear. Theological debates about whether Spanish souls could be saved through suffering, just as native souls supposedly were. It was Caligula's Rome transplanted to the Caribbean, with Columbus as an emperor convinced of his own divinity. By 1499, the colony was eating itself. Spanish colonists were dying from disease, despair, and Columbus's justice. The natives were approaching extinction. Gold production had virtually ceased because there weren't enough functional bodies to work the mines. Ships arrived from Spain to find a settlement that looked prosperous from a distance, but revealed itself as a charnel house up close. Columbus's solution was predictably insane. More control. He instituted hourly roll calls. He required written reports from every Spanish colonist detailing their activities. He created a rotating system of mutual surveillance, where colonists were responsible for reporting on assigned partners. The bureaucracy of paranoia consumed more energy than actual governance. The breaking point came when Columbus ordered the execution of Spanish nobles who'd questioned his policies. Even his brothers suggested this might be excessive. Columbus responded by questioning their loyalty. The brothers fell in line, but the damage was done. Word reached Spain that the viceroy was executing not just commoners, but men of breeding, treating Spanish blood as carelessly as native. Ferdinand and Isabella had wanted an empire, not an asylum. They'd granted Columbus authority to govern, not to reign as a mad king. The reports were becoming impossible to ignore. Spanish colonists begging for rescue, nobles executed for minor infractions, a colony producing more corpses than gold. The monarchs made their decision. Francisco de Bobadilla was chosen for his reputation as a firm but fair administrator. His secret orders were simple: investigate Columbus, and if necessary, remove him. He sailed with the authority of the crown and the hope of colonists who'd smuggled out desperate pleas for salvation. Columbus, isolated in his paranoid paradise, remained convinced of his righteousness. He was God's chosen instrument. His brothers were his holy enforcers. The suffering was necessary, the terror was justified, the Spanish who complained were weak, and the natives who died were blessed. He'd created a perfect system where everyone, Spanish and native alike, served their proper role in his divine mission. He had no idea the chains were already on their way. But then Columbus had always been better at creating chains than recognizing when they were meant for him. Francisco de Bobadilla arrived in Santo Domingo on August 23, 1500, with royal authority and a talent for timing. The first thing he saw was a gallows decorated with 7 Spanish corpses, their crime being insufficient enthusiasm for Columbus's governance. The second thing he saw was 2 more Spaniards awaiting execution the next morning. Bobadilla had seen enough. Columbus was in the interior, personally overseeing a mass punishment of natives who'd failed to meet cotton quotas. Diego was managing a slave auction. Bartholomew was investigating reports of a Spanish colonist who'd shown suspicious sympathy for native suffering. The Columbus brothers had achieved perfect synchronization in their machinery of misery, which made their arrest almost anticlimactic. When the soldiers came for Columbus, he assumed it was a misunderstanding. Surely Ferdinand and Isabella appreciated his firm hand. Surely they understood that empire required enforcement. He dressed in his finest clothes for the arrest, including the chains the Admiral of the Ocean Sea was entitled to wear as symbols of office. The irony of exchanging ceremonial chains for judicial ones was lost on him. Bobadilla's investigation was thorough and damning. He interviewed colonists who described a regime that made medieval dungeons look humanitarian. Spanish settlers testified about being tortured for minor infractions. Even hardened soldiers spoke of atrocities that haunted their dreams. The native testimony wasn't recorded. Corpses make poor witnesses, but their absence spoke volumes. Columbus's defense was a masterwork of deflection. Yes, he'd been strict, but strictness was necessary when dealing with savages and malcontents. Yes, some had died, but death was common in frontier settlements. Yes, he'd authorized certain punishments, but always within the framework of Spanish law. He'd written the laws himself, but that was a technicality. Every atrocity had a justification. Every cruelty had a context. Every horror had a holy purpose. The voyage back to Spain gave Columbus time to perfect his martyrdom. He wore his chains constantly, refusing offers to remove them. He wrote letters comparing himself to biblical prophets persecuted for righteousness. He calculated the exact amount of gold he'd sent to Spain, ignoring the human cost of its extraction. He was a visionary surrounded by small minds, a servant of God betrayed by bureaucrats. The other prisoners told different stories. One colonist described watching Columbus order a woman's tongue cut out for suggesting the natives were overworked. Another recalled the time Columbus had a man's ears nailed to a post for stealing bread, leaving him there until the ears tore free. A priest quietly mentioned the native children who'd been fed to dogs for the entertainment of bored soldiers. But these were details, and Columbus had always been a big-picture man. In Spain, Columbus's arrival in chains caused exactly the sensation he'd hoped for. How could the hero of the ocean sea be treated like a common criminal? Ferdinand and Isabella, masters of political theatre, immediately ordered his release. They expressed shock at Bobadilla's excessive zeal. They promised investigation and justice. They also quietly kept the governorship of Hispaniola for themselves. Columbus spent the next months lobbying for restoration. He presented accounts showing the colony's profitability. Creative mathematics had always been his strength. He submitted plans for more efficient extraction methods. He offered to lead a new expedition that would finally find the passage to Asia he still insisted was just beyond the next island. His persistence was either admirable or pathological, depending on your tolerance for delusion. The royal court was divided. Some saw Columbus as a visionary, unfairly maligned by lesser men. Others whispered about the reports from Hispaniola, the stories that even hardened conquistadors found disturbing. The clergy was particularly conflicted. Columbus had brought souls to Christ, but at what cost? The theological gymnastics required to justify his methods were becoming exhausting. Finally, Ferdinand and Isabella reached a compromise that satisfied no one completely, which in politics meant it was perfect. Columbus would retain his titles and honours. He would receive a share of revenues from the territories he'd discovered. He would even be permitted a fourth voyage. But he would never again govern. His days as Viceroy of Nightmares were over. Columbus accepted these terms with the grace of a man convinced the world owed him more. He began planning his fourth voyage immediately, still certain that Japan lay just past the next strait. He recruited crew members who either didn't know his reputation or were desperate enough not to care. He promised them wealth beyond measure, because some habits died harder than the natives of Hispaniola. The fourth voyage launched in 1502 with 4 ships and 140 men. Columbus was 51, old for an explorer, ancient for a man who'd spent decades perfecting institutional cruelty. His body was failing. Arthritis, gout, and what modern doctors might recognize as reactive arthritis from untreated infections. But his delusions remained healthy. He was explicitly forbidden from landing at Hispaniola, a restriction that rankled. How dare they bar him from the colony he'd fertilized with so much blood? He sailed past his former domain, noting with satisfaction that a hurricane was approaching. When he tried to warn the new governor, Nicolás de Ovando, his message was ignored. The hurricane destroyed 20 ships and killed 500 Spaniards, including Bobadilla. Columbus saw this as divine vindication. The The voyage itself was a cascade of failures dressed as adventures. Columbus explored the Central American coast, still convinced it was the edge of Asia. He lost ships to storms and wood-boring worms. He'd battled natives who'd heard stories of Spanish hospitality and declined the experience. He spent a year marooned in Jamaica, surviving on native charity while writing increasingly unhinged letters about cosmic injustice. During this marooning, Columbus experienced his own taste of desperation. His men were starving. The natives, having learned from other islands what Spanish gratitude looked like, were reluctant to help. Columbus used his knowledge of astronomy to predict a lunar eclipse, threatening to steal the moon if they didn't provide food. It worked, but the fact that he had to resort to parlor tricks to avoid starvation was its own form of poetic justice. He was finally rescued in 1504 and returned to Spain broken in body but not in spirit. He spent his final years pursuing legal battles over his titles and revenues. He wrote letters to anyone who'd listen about the injustices he'd suffered. He compiled books of biblical prophecies that proved his divine mission. He never once acknowledged that his governance had been anything but exemplary. Columbus died on May 20, 1506, in Valladolid, still wearing the chains he'd refused to remove as symbols of his martyrdom. His last words were reportedly, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit," though some witnesses claimed he was actually calculating his unpaid percentages from Hispaniola. Both versions were probably true. Columbus had always been gifted at simultaneity. His funeral was modest. Ferdinand and Isabella sent representatives but didn't attend personally. The eulogy focused on his discoveries rather than his governance. The priest spoke of his role in bringing Christianity to new lands while carefully avoiding specifics about his methods. It was a masterclass in selective memory, the first draft of the sanitization that would transform Columbus from torturer to hero. But on Hispaniola, the Taino had no interest in Columbus's rehabilitation. They were too busy dying. The systems he'd created outlived him, refined and expanded by successors who'd learned from the master. The tribute quotas continued. The punishment platforms remained busy. The only thing that changed was the efficiency. Columbus's replacements were better at extraction and worse at record-keeping. Within a generation, the Taino were effectively extinct. The exact numbers are disputed. Was it 90% mortality or 95%? But the result was the same. An entire people reduced to historical footnotes and genetic traces. Columbus had promised to find a new world, and he delivered by erasing the old one. His body wouldn't rest peacefully. First buried in Valladolid, then moved to Seville, then to Santo Domingo, then to Havana, then back to Seville. Even in death, Columbus couldn't stop travelling. His bones shuffled between cathedrals like cursed relics of empire. Each reburial came with ceremonies celebrating his achievements. None mentioned the voices that had been silenced to make those achievements possible. The chains he'd worn as symbols of martyrdom were preserved as relics. Somewhere in Seville they still exist, iron loops that once held the man who put chains on a hemisphere. They're smaller than you'd expect. But then, Columbus had always proven that small men could cast enormous shadows, especially when those shadows were cast by funeral pyres. Columbus spent his final year in Valladolid like a ghost haunting his own legacy, shuffling between his rented rooms and the royal court, clutching documents that proved his titles, his percentages, his divine right to profits from lands soaked in blood. He wore white robes like a penitent, though the only thing he repented was his reduced circumstances. His body was failing. Joints swollen with arthritis, eyes clouded by inflammation, the accumulated infections of decades finally collecting their due. But his delusions remained pristine. He dictated letters with the fervour of a prophet denied his rightful honour. To the Pope, explaining how his discoveries would fund a new crusade. To Ferdinand, calculating exact percentages owed from territories he could no longer visit. To anyone who would listen, describing visions of gold mines just beyond where he'd been allowed to explore. The letters grew increasingly mystical. He signed them with elaborate cryptographic symbols that he claimed God had revealed to him. His servants learnt to nod and fetch more parchment. When he died on Ascension Day, 1506, it was with the quiet whimper of a man who'd expected trumpets. The court barely noticed. Ferdinand was busy with other matters. Isabella had been dead last for 2 years. The New World had new heroes now, men who'd learned from Columbus that brutality worked best when wrapped in bureaucracy. His death was recorded in official documents with the same dispassionate tone he'd once used to describe native mutilations. The funeral was a modest affair. A few Dominican friars, some minor nobles, his sons Diego and Ferdinand looking uncomfortable in their mourning clothes. The eulogy focused on his navigation skills and his piety, skating delicately over the decades between discovery and death. Nobody mentioned Hispaniola's transformation from paradise to charnel house. Nobody counted the missing Taino. It was easier to praise abstract achievements than acknowledge specific atrocities. But death was just the beginning of Columbus's journey into myth. His sons began the rehabilitation almost immediately, commissioning biographies that emphasized divine inspiration over indigenous extermination. Diego pursued the family's legal claims with the dedication of a man who'd inherited both titles and a talent for selective memory. Ferdinand wrote histories that transformed his father from a gold-obsessed tyrant into a misunderstood visionary. The makeover was remarkably effective. The bones themselves became props in this posthumous theatre. First buried in Valladolid's Franciscan monastery, they were exhumed in 1509 and moved to Seville. Diego had them shipped to Santo Domingo in 1537, placing the admiral in the colony he'd birthed through brutality. When the French took Hispaniola in 1795, the Spanish moved what they claimed were Columbus's remains to Havana. When Cuba gained independence in 1898, back to Seville they went. Each translation came with pageantry celebrating the great discoverer. Nobody asked the Taino what they thought. There weren't any left to ask. The sanitization accelerated with distance. By the 17th century, Columbus had become a symbol of Catholic expansion. By the 18th, he represented Enlightenment values of exploration and science, the bad math conveniently forgotten. By the 19th, he was an American hero, evidence that individuals could change history. Italian Americans adopted him as proof of their contributions. Spanish nationalists claimed him as evidence of imperial glory. Everyone wanted credit. Nobody wanted responsibility. Statues sprouted like mushrooms after rain. Columbus pointing west, Columbus holding a globe, Columbus with cross and sword. Bronze and marble Columbus in every major city, stone Columbus guarding harbours, painted Columbus in countless museums. The poses were heroic, the faces noble, the hands clean. Sculptors gave him the dignity history had denied his victims. Children learnt to sing songs about sailing the ocean blue. Nobody taught them the verses about sailing it red. The myth required careful maintenance. Historians who mentioned the genocide were dismissed as revisionists. Native voices were excluded from the narrative. Extinction has that effect. School textbooks reduced centuries of systematic extermination to a footnote about cultural contact and population decline. The passive voice did heavy lifting. Mistakes were made, deaths occurred, populations decreased. Nobody did anything. Everything just happened. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, the land remembered differently. Archaeological digs uncovered mass graves with cut marks on bones. DNA studies found Taino ancestry hiding in populations that Spanish census takers had declared extinct. Oral traditions, preserved in fragments, spoke of the time before the sails came. But these were academic footnotes to a story already written in statue bronze and street names. Columbus Day became a holiday in the United States in 1968, just as other heroes were being questioned. The timing was perfect for a nation that preferred its history simplified. Parades celebrated courage and discovery. Politicians made speeches about vision and perseverance. Italian Americans defended their hero against rising criticism. Native Americans asked why their genocide warranted a federal holiday. The arguments followed predictable patterns, each side armed with different versions of the same man. The Catholic Church considered him for sainthood multiple times. He had, after all, brought Christianity to millions. That most of them died shortly after was apparently beside the point. The investigations always stalled on the details. Even by medieval standards, Columbus's methods were difficult to sanctify. The Church settled for praising his intentions while remaining vague about his actions. It was a diplomatic masterpiece of acknowledging nothing while implying everything. Modern Hispaniola tells the story differently. The Dominican Republic and Haiti share an island stripped of its original inhabitants. Sugar plantations worked by African slaves replaced the gold mines worked by Taino. The systems Columbus created outlived their creator, refined by generations of colonizers who'd learned that suffering could be industrialized. Tourist resorts now occupy beaches where Taino villages once stood. Visitors photograph sunsets where blood once mixed with sand. In Spain, the Columbus Lighthouse in Seville houses what might be his remains. DNA testing in 2006 suggested the bones were his, though certainty remains elusive. Tourists pay euros to see the ornate tomb, reading plaques that mention discovery and courage. The gift shop sells replica maps and compass roses. Nobody sells replica chains or hawk's bells. Some souvenirs are too honest for commerce. The quincentenary in 1992 brought new scrutiny. Native groups protested celebrations of genocide. Historians published accounts that included tiny perspectives. Some cities reconsidered their Columbus statues. But the myth had deep roots, watered by centuries of convenient forgetting. For every statue toppled, defenders arose to explain why genocide was actually civilizing, why slavery was actually labor reform, why Columbus was actually a man of his time. As if his time hadn't included people horrified by his actions. Today Columbus exists in permanent multiplicity. Hero to some, villain to others. Historical Rorschach test, revealing more about the viewer than the viewed. American cities debate removing his statues, while cruise ships named for his vessels sail Caribbean waters. DNA studies find Taino ancestry in Puerto Rico, Cuba, and other islands, while history books still speak of extinction. The Columbus of myth and the Columbus of history occupy the same space without touching, parallel narratives that never intersect. But on quiet nights in the Caribbean, when the tourist boats have docked and the resorts have dimmed their lights, the land remembers. In the rustle of palm fronds, in the lap of waves against shores that watched wooden ships arrive, in the silence where millions of voices once rose. The Taino had no written language, but the earth wrote their story in absence. Every empty village, every abandoned field, every sacred site turned Spanish settlement. Columbus's true monument isn't bronze or marble, but negative space, the shape of what's missing. His legacy lives in language that launders horror, encounter instead of invasion, colonization instead of conquest, population decline instead of genocide. It lives in legal systems that still trace authority to papal bulls, granting Christians dominion over heathens. It lives in economic structures that still extract value from brown bodies for distant capitals. It lives in every child, taught to celebrate a navigator's courage without learning the price of his navigation. Columbus wanted gold and glory, governance and God's favor. He got them all, for a time, but his truest achievement was teaching empires how to erase their crimes through repetition and rhetoric. He showed that atrocity could be administrative, horror could be policy, and genocide could be rebranded as discovery if you just kept insisting long enough. Others would perfect these lessons, applying them to other continents, other peoples, other erasures. Columbus didn't invent colonialism, but he wrote its instruction manual in Taino blood. To sleep well, wrapped in the comfortable fiction that history is progress and progress is good. Dream of brave explorers and new worlds waiting to be discovered. Don't think about the hands that couldn't fill their hawk's bells with gold. Don't count the missing millions. Don't wonder why discovery required so much dying. And if someone ever promises you a shortcut to Asia, maybe check their math. And maybe ask who's already living along the way. Maybe wonder what discovery means to the discovered. Maybe remember that Columbus died in his bed, still believing he'd found paradise. He had. He'd just burned it down first. Sweet dreams. Thank you for listening, one last time. May your sleep be deep, your dreams quiet, and your mind at peace. Good night.